Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Babylon Podcast. In this episode, I speak with Graham Oppy. He's a philosopher at Monash University. He's the author of multiple books, including Naturalism and Religion and Atheism, The Basics. We talk about naturalism, methodology, atheism, and much more. It was an honor to have a conversation with such a prolific philosopher. In the words of William Lane Craig, Graham is scary smart. If you're interested in having conversations and making friends with people who love these types of conversations, be sure to join the Discord, the link of which is in the description of the video below. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram as well if you're interested. Anyways, I hope you enjoy this episode. I do my best to try to keep up. All right, everyone, welcome to another episode of the Babylon Podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of having a conversation with Dr. Graham Oppy. He's an Australian philosopher at Monash University, contains degrees in philosophy and mathematics. These are bachelors from Melbourne University, and a PhD from Princeton. He's written numerous books that are very dense and are very informative, including Arguing About Gods, Naturalism and Religion, Atheism, The Basics, and really he's written more books than good ideas I've had in my entire life. I think your most recent book is called Is There a God with Kenny Pierce, and I think it's part of the Little Debates About Big Questions series.
Yeah,
So everyone
that's right.
go, and the links to all these books are going to be in the description of the video below. So feel free to go ahead and give them a look see. But anyways, Dr. Graham Oppy, thank you so much for coming on.
It's a pleasure.
So I'm going to take this as a learning exercise because as I've told you before the podcast, even though I am a student in philosophy, I am exactly that. I am a student in philosophy. So of course, uh, much of this is going to go over my head, but I'll do my best to ensure that um, I stay on track. But and I've listened. The reason I'm very excited to have you on is because I've listened to many podcasts that you've been on. You've been on many religious people's podcasts. You've also been on a lot of podcasts where the host is an atheist, so they're more sort of asking you about these sorts of questions. What makes you unique among many other popular atheist commentators is that one, you argue from a very deeply philosophical perspective, but also it's it's your method of analyzing and encountering debate, and this probably has much to do with your thesis, which as you said before, your thesis was on the philosophy of religion. um, and so my first question, the first thing that I'm like interested in is what is your style of encountering religious conversations, because you don't seem to have a normative issue with religion, at least as far as I'm concerned. You're not trying to convert people to atheism or anything like that. You seem to just sort of be right across the aisle from someone that you disagree with and sort of um, discuss ideas. And so yeah, I guess, how do you approach someone who has a completely different viewpoint from you?
So, well, the first thing you want to do is you want to find out what they think, right? So, to start with, you just sort of engage in conversation where you're just swapping opinions, just saying what you believe. Um, and then, I mean, it depends on the nature of the exchange. If somebody thinks that they can persuade me to change my mind, then I listen to what they say and respond accordingly. If they don't, then the account is going to be more about just kind of advancing mutual understanding of our positions. And my kind of overall strategy generally, the people who I think will benefit most from the conversations that I have are people who were like me, who were way back in the past believers, but had questions that eventually turned into non-belief. Um, and it's just sort of modeling the way that non-belief can be sort of carried through your life. Something like that. That's the kind of overall strategy that I've got.
Mhm. And what made you become invested in philosophy? Because as you said, I think you grew up in a Methodist family, and then I believe it was around when you were a teenager that you sort of stopped believing. Was it your views on religion and your philosophical inquiries about religion that made you go down the academic route of philosophy, or what made you so interested in philosophy?
So it wasn't really. I got for my I think for my 16th birthday, I was given a copy of Bertrand Russell's autobiography, which I read from beginning to end. It's quite a big book. And by the time I'd read it, I'd wanted to know more about philosophy. That was the book that made me interested in philosophers and philosophy. And while I was still at high school, I read a little bit more philosophy, but many of the things I tried to read, I couldn't understand at all. Like I tried to read Hume's treatise and I just couldn't get anywhere with it. Um, and when I went to university, I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew that I wanted to study maths and physics and philosophy and history and philosophy of science. And that somewhere in all of that, I hoped I would find something that I could sort of carry forwards for the rest of my life. And after I'd done 3 years of maths major, and 3 years of philosophy major, I was still undecided. And I sort of vaguely thought about doing 2 honours years. So in the Australian system, the fourth year is a separate independent year that you go into if you're in the kind of honours stream. And part of what you do is you write a small thesis, and then the other part of it is just a lot of classes. And I thought that I would do two, but I started with philosophy. And by the time I'd finished the philosophy honours year, I thought I might as well just keep going with this. So, I mean, easily could have decided to do the maths first, and then who knows what would have happened. But
Mhm.
that
Yeah,
was
it would have been an interesting. Yeah, I wonder if you would have been debating religious apologists if you went down the math field, or if you would have been arguing about whether or not string theory was a good model for the future of reality. That's interesting. Yeah.
so there are various people who do um, various atheists who do debating whose background is in maths and physics and so on. So it's not impossible that I would have ended up doing the same thing, but it would have been from a very different perspective, probably.
Y Right, exactly. So Sean Carroll, physicist, and he's debated William Lane Craig, as have you. But if you watch Sean Carroll's debate against William Lane Craig, he's arguing why religion is a bad theory, which is actually very similar towards your method when we're talking about naturalism. Not, but we'll get deeper into that. But then you also have other people like Lawrence Krauss, where he'll sort of make very, very detailed scientific claims about how the nature of reality works. And then you have people like Brian Cox, who's across the pond from me, where I think he even said, I don't know if he said this in a debate or if he just said this on his Infinite Monkey Cages podcast, where the existence of the Hadron Collider, or the the power that the Hadron Collider itself somehow disproves the existence of ghosts, because we would have been able to detect them if they interact with photons. So yeah, so your method probably would have been different if you went down the math route. Um, or who knows, maybe not. But I do want to, I really do want to give a shout out to your books that you've published. I have one here. Um, this is the first one that I read from you, called Naturalism and Religion. And the reason why I really admire your books is because philosophers are notorious for writing books that are incredibly difficult to understand. I think I always use Slavoj Zizek's most recent book. I don't know if it's his most, he probably came up with a new one after that, but called Sex and the Absolute, and it's incomprehensible. Or even read anything by Foucault, or any of the old school philosophers. Try to read Hume. Very difficult to read. And I don't know why it is, but philosophers just like making books difficult to, to understand. But yours, it is difficult. It is very technical, and it does require slow reading. But but I do think that people can pick it up, and if they really, really want to understand these deep philosophical questions, they can with your books, because your books, it doesn't treat the audience dumb, but it also doesn't sort of come off as pretentious, which is the criticism that a lot of philosophical books have. So I always recommend your books before trying to find 6 hours to read through the first chapter of Madness by Foucault. So I appreciate your method of writing. Um,
So I will say something about that. So um, I think the further back you go, the harder my books are to read because the first books were written strictly. My target was other philosophers, whereas something like Atheism, the Basics, I really was trying to write for a wider audience. So I, it's good to know that the book turned out to that book in Naturalism and Religion turned out to be a bit more accessible.
mhm. Okay, that does make sense. I would say, would you say your most accessible book is Atheism, the Basics?
Um, yeah, I think if you were going to read one book that I've written, that would be a good one to
Hmm.
read. Uh, in terms of citations, which is something that academics use to measure the impact of a book, arguing about gods and ontological arguments and belief in God are sort of about equal. But part of the reason for that is that they're the oldest of the books, so they've
Hmm.
been around longer.
Hmm.
So this
Yeah,
had more time to have a little bit of impact.
gotcha. Yeah. Um, and so I now before we get, any deeper into sort of discussing atheism and naturalism, I do also want to sort of ask you about how it is that you manage to be so respectful and cordial in many of these debates, because debates nowadays have gotten this aura and this reputation of being very combative, especially around 2006 and 7, where, back then when atheists were debating religious people, the expectation was that one side was going to sort of smack down the other, whereas your debates, they're very respectful, and it doesn't seem like there's an expectation that you're going to coalesce on a particular viewpoint, but you're just expressing differing ideas. um so do you is that intentional, or do you think that that's just the way you sort of feel in having these debates or conversations? You're not interested in sort of, winning the argument. You're just interested in having a nice, fun conversation.
So I think all of that is right. I mean, I do think that the kinds of combative debates, especially ones where there are set pieces and one person talks for half an hour and then the other person responds for half an hour, are kind of a waste of time. And if you're a certain disposition, you might like to be in the audience and kind of cheer for one side and boo the other side. But nothing is going to be achieved by in those kinds of events, I don't think. Um, I would much rather have a conversation to somebody where we're both thinking about what the other person is saying and engaging with it. And so partly it's a deliberate strategy. It's something, I want more people to engage in the kind of way that I do. But it's also something that comes naturally, I think. I've always liked conversations with people who disagree with me. I've always liked doing that the when they've got a kind of similar attitude to
Hmm.
mine. I think there are benefits. It's much more likely that you'll be really dismissive of other opinions if you've never really sat down and talked to somebody who holds those opinions seriously. Uh, I think maybe in the background, there are some views that I've got about us and our capacities, how fallible we are, how likely it is for any of us that much of what we believe is wrong, how how vast our ignorance is, and so on. I just don't see any point in um, going in boots and all guns blazing against somebody else.
No, and I think it's done you more service than not, because you'll see a lot of religious people in the comment section of these videos, and most of these debates are hosted by religious YouTube channels, and the comments are overwhelmingly very supportive of you, and they admire you because they say like, well, these are two intellectual giants going head to head, and that seems to be one of the descriptions of you that has been given you. I think William Lane Craig, I think he referred to you as the most formidable atheist alive right now, and he's referred to you as scary smart. So coming from probably the most renowned, religious debater, it's quite a compliment. And he's not.
Well, I would kind of reject it. There are lots of good um, atheist and agnostic philosophers of religion. I could name a few, but I mean, if I do, that's sort of invidious because I'll forget people. But maybe I should name a few people. I'm Paul Draper, Evan Fales, Greg Dawes, Tiddy Smith. There are lots of people who are good, and there's no way that I'm going to agree with Bill on that one.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good. So now I do want to sort of get into um, what I've thought of as sufficient atheism, where people appear to be atheists for completely different reasons. There are some people that are atheists for moral reasons, where they'll find what's in the Old Testament or the New Testament morally objectionable, and so they lose their faith in a God because of that. And then you also have other atheists who um, are very what William Lane Craig would refer to as very surface level analysis of religious arguments. So I think when he referred to this, he was specifically talking about the New Atheist movement that was very popular back in 2006. And the reason I find this interesting is because, for one, it's for if I'm reading your arguments correctly and understanding them correctly, the way that you approach the question about atheism is that you view it as competing worldviews, competing theories about how, and it's just a matter of trying to identify which theory, which worldview is the least complex, is the simplest. It requires the least amount of posits. Is that a fair assessment before I go any further?
Uh, it's close, but not quite. So, yes, I think that when we're thinking about our own position and competing positions, we're thinking about worldviews, we're thinking about theories. And we have to think that our own theory is the best. Otherwise, I mean, you can't really believe, go on believing if you think that there's something better that other people believe.
Hmm.
You'd want to swap positions. I think that to determine the goodness of the positions, there are two factors. One is simplicity. So, on the one hand, you want to minimize your commitments of various kinds. On the other hand, you want to maximize explanation. Um, and so you want to explain as much as you can with as little as possible. And there's a kind of delicate trade-off there because if you add in more posits, you can explain more, um, right? So, but uh, but sometimes you don't want to have explanations for things. For example, some things just genuinely are coincidences, and if you're postulating stuff to explain them, you're just going wrong. What you want is is the a minimal theory that explains ideally everything.
Hmm. Okay. And that's how you approach these debates, right? It's sort of, and the reason why I'm so interested in this is because, all right, so I'm going to ask this question, and I do not mean to throw aspersions at these people, but because I think it leads to an important sociological question. So, as I said, William Lane Craig has sort of criticized the new atheist movements for not being particularly sophisticated about religion. Their critiques are very surface level. They're very, focused on the moral aspects of the issues. Um, but and I think there's an obvious reason why there's a disconnect here. I think the people that the new atheist movement were sort of focused on was the general public, trying to convince them, and that's the way that they perceived religion. They weren't deep philosophers. Whereas William Lane Craig was more focused, and I could be wrong, I don't know him personally, but people such as him and Phaser sort of seem to be more focused on the academics because the academic institution is very secular as well. So they might have different audiences, and that might be the reason why they sort of approach religious debates differently. Um, but the reason I'm asking this is because the new atheist movement was very popular and it convinced people, quite a few, But do you think, I don't know how familiar you are with their viewpoints are, and if you're not familiar with them, is just simply saying the average person walking down the street who doesn't believe in God and they ask him, "Why don't you believe in God?" And he says, "Well, there's no evidence for it." Is that as good enough as we can expect from the general public, or do you think there should be more of an expectation to ground your beliefs?
Okay, so this raises lots of interesting questions. So let's start with this. Suppose we shift away from religion and we think about science, and you don't have a background in science, but you read some pop physics books, right? And so um, you hear about this thing called the uncertainty principle, which is described in um, sort of metaphorical terms in the pop physics books. Uh, is that level of understanding enough for the general public, or should you want more? Uh, it seems fine to me. What matters if you're a member of the general public is not that you suddenly acquire expertise in quantum physics and astronomy and cosmology and so on, but that you're aware that there's quite a lot of stuff in those subjects that's just settled. The experts just agree that there's just stuff here that we know.
Mhm,
Um, and that's really what you would want the general public to come to understand. Um, Now, should we think that things are different when it comes to philosophy of religion, when it comes to the topic of belief in God? Obviously, there's a kind of important difference in well, I think there's a kind of obvious difference in the subject matters, because where there's expert agreement on a whole lot of stuff in physics, there isn't much expert agreement on anything in philosophy of religion. But nonetheless, you might think, whatever views you've got in religion, there are experts, or in philosophy, there are experts who of a certain stripe who have a certain kind of agreement. So there are lots. So, for example, if you're a theist, you might think, I'm quite happy just to suppose that, as far as the kind of metaphysical questions and the deep theoretical questions go, Alvin Planting is basically getting it right. And that will be just a little bit like thinking, as far as the physics goes, Stephen Hawking was basically getting it right.
mhm.
Um, and I'm not sure that you really do want more from average people in the street than that. But maybe I should throw it back to you at this point, because maybe that's not the answer you were expecting.
Right. Well, the reason that I asked it is because with things like physics and quantum mechanics, you're right. We can't possibly expect anyone to be able to solve you
The
know
Schrodinger equation.
Schrodinger's equation, right? They give them a wave function and then
Yeah.
normalize it. It's unlikely that we'll be able to do that. But with those sorts of questions, they're not very consequential. Whether or not the average person knows how to do that doesn't really matter. It doesn't even really matter that much if they care.
Mm.
With religion, the reason I find religion to be unique is that that might be the question that matters the most in all of existence. As the famous philosopher Louis C.K. said, if you're an atheist, you better pray every night that God doesn't exist right before you go to sleep. Uh, the consequences are just so grave of that, of you being wrong on that.
So, so I guess in a way I don't really agree with that. I mean, one thing to bear in mind is that there are thousands of religions, right? And everybody takes their chances. I mean, if you hitch your wagon to a particular religion, there's thousands that you've rejected, and for many of them, the consequences of getting it wrong are just as bad as the consequences of getting it wrong for some style of Protestant or Catholic Christianity. Um, it, I actually don't think that I mean, there are certain senses in which, so I say this at the end of the debate book with Kenny Pierce, there are lots of issues that strike me as really pressing. that in some ways are more important than the religious question. The religious question is kind of important for sociological reasons because people form cliques and people get excluded. You know, people from one religion will persecute people from another religion. So religion matters for those kinds of reasons. But if you think about the big challenges that we collectively face on this planet, things like climate change, right? Scarce, future scarcity of resources, pollution, and so on. It, it doesn't matter whether you're an atheist or a theist when it comes to addressing those questions. But that's how it seems to me,
Hmm.
anyway. So I don't think that it's that being theist or being atheist is really that significant, except for kind of these narrow sociological reasons,
Hmm.
right? That if you're the lone atheist somewhere in a town in it's not you don't call it the outback, rural
Oh, right.
Alabama, things may not go well for you,
Hmm.
right? Socially. That's the kind of way that religion matters.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. In that regard, I think I would agree with you. Um, it certainly does matter sociologically. I think especially in the United States, one of the I think it was determined that the most accurate predictor of whether of who you voted for was whether or not you were a white evangelical Christian. So there's certainly many sociological aspects in which religion absolutely matters, and I would actually agree with you that um, there's so many religions out there, right? The consequences of you not believing in Islam are just as high of the consequences of you not believing in Christianity, and there's millions of these, right? Um, so I do agree with you there. I guess my concern was more of, is it enough to just simply say, well, there's no evidence for it, and that's all you need to that's as far as it goes, because that's always been my response to people like who say that the new atheists weren't very sophisticated. My response was always like, you don't really need to be that sophisticated. I think their arguments are good enough. I think it's fine. I think that's as far as the general public or really anyone should expect. And you brought up something interesting that I did want to ask you about how it's very easy and also expected for the average person to sort of lay the expertise on behalf of the chemist or the climate scientist when it comes to what to believe. And then you said, you asked the question, does this translate into philosophers? Well, we don't really agree on much. I think there were two things that I noticed. There was a famous, and I'm sure you know about it, that famous philosophy paper that sort of polled a bunch of philosophers on questions about, idealism, external world skepticism,
Yep.
atheism. The one thing that I noticed that almost very, very few philosophers sort of agreed with, I think it was less than 4%, was idealism. Very few philosophers took idealism seriously. So, in that respect, is that a low enough percentage for the average person to say, I know nothing about idealism,
Oh,
but I could
I
go ahead
think you've
and
frozen.
reject it? Uh oh.
Sorry, there was a big pause there. So
Uh oh. Am I good now?
yeah, you're good now, but there was a pause, and I actually missed some of what you were saying.
Oh, shit.
The video froze and
Uh-oh.
the sound dropped out just for a second. But so you're talking about the Phil Papers survey and how few people go for idealism. Of
Mhm,
course, you wind the clock back 100 years, and idealism was the predominant philosophy, maybe a bit more than 100 years now. Go back 130 years, and almost everybody's an idealist. You might think that there are kind of fads in philosophy and that idealism's about due to have a resurgence. I mean, some people certainly suspect that that might be the case,
mhm.
but
Well,
but you're right. The Phil Papers survey just shows that philosophical opinion is all over the place.
yeah,
There are very few views that get above 50% um, agreement amongst philosophers. Very few.
mhm. Yeah, and I think, I mean, that's just testament to the fact that, or in my opinion, that with philosophy, we're dealing really with arguments that it's very difficult to conduct a study in philosophy to determine which position is the correct one. Much of it has to do with either philosophical syllogisms or deductive, inductive, or abductive reasoning. It's very difficult, as opposed to the hard science where we can pretty much conduct a study and coalesce on a particular viewpoint based on what that study says. So philosophy is difficult in that respect, right?
So we've got lots of data that we know is relevant to physics, chemistry, biology, and so on. And
Mhm.
we're quite happy to speak about what we collectively know in those areas. Philosophy, there's there's there isn't a very large kernel of stuff on which there's agreement. So agreement, when people disagree in say about a current question in physics, they'll agree about what experiments in theory would settle the matter or something like that very often. Whereas when philosophers disagree, it's not like they can point to something and say, when we've got that, it will settle our disagreement here, because the disagreement continues down to the what it would take in order to resolve the matter. There's disagreement about that too. In philosophy, it feels like it's sort of disagreement all the way down.
Yeah. Um, and you would expect, I think I remember you saying that your position on indeterminism relies on some interpretation of quantum mechanics, but if that interpretation of quantum mechanics turns out not to be true, I'm not a physicist, so I don't know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But just for the sake of the argument, th- the interpretation of quantum mechanics that prevails is one that um, claim basically forces determinism to be true. One would expect there's probably going to be more arguments that come up later on based on people interpreting the data differently, or maybe compatibilists sort of saying doesn't really matter whether or not determinism is true. Sort of we're defining free will differently. Um, but I do now want to move on to naturalism, which is your bread and butter. And the first book I read from your repertoire was Naturalism and Religion. And the book's interesting because your views on naturalism, and you admit this, that your definitions are very controversial, or some people would consider them to be
Yeah.
controversial. So starting off with naturalism, and you've discussed at length how it's very important that we establish our definitions because two people can be just arguing past one another because their definitional priors are completely different. When you're talking about naturalism, your definition is that you view naturalism as the conjunctive claim, both the methodological and the ontological definition I believe you adopt, that there are none but natural causal entities with none but natural causal powers, and that well established science is our touchstone for identifying these causal entities and natural causal powers. Is that a fair assessment of your claim?
Yeah, that's a pretty accurate statement of it. Um, I do regard it as, I mean, it's not, it's kind of stipulative. For the purposes of the book, that's what I mean by naturalism, so that readers will understand me. Um, there are many different understandings of naturalism. Unsurprisingly, I think part of what explains this is that natural, by contrast to the non-natural or the unnatural or whatever, is a positive term. And so naturalism's got to be a good thing, right? And so um, you get lots and lots of people who want to call themselves naturalists and have, but they have very different positions. And we can accommodate that under the term naturalism, um, sort of in general. But once we get down to trying to make more specific arguments, you need to be clear about what you're arguing for. So I'm the point of the definition is just a stipulation. This is what I'm going to mean by naturalism for the purposes of this book, because there's no hope of getting agreement uh, amongst philosophers on a sort of single definition of naturalism. There are just too many different kinds of views. So to indicate one of the kinds of disputes, there are some people who think that if you're a naturalist, then you can't accept any kinds of abstract objects, right? You have to suppose that there are no abstract objects, whereas my definition is completely neutral. on that question. All it said was something about the nature of the causal objects, that they're all natural and they have only natural causal powers. Um, but other people will want to say that the kind of important thing about naturalism is that that's all there is. There's just the natural objects and the natural causal powers, and there isn't anything else. And they might also add, and moreover, everything that you can say that's true about natural reality, you can say in a language, the language of natural science. Now, I don't put that claim into my account of naturalism either. I'm leaving it open. I'm actually skeptical that you can do about the possibility of reducing normative and evaluative claims to scientific claims. I don't think that you can do that, but I don't think that we should throw normative and evaluative language away. So I think that there I'm thinking that that approach to naturalism is too narrow. And if it could work, fine. If you could give a fully naturalistic account of ethics, well, fine. I'd embrace it. I'm just skeptical that it can be done.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think it's a good definition because you said it's very inclusive towards many different variations of naturalism that some people may have. Some people are very staunchly materialistic in their definition of naturalism, where others aren't quite so much. Um, I think you get even into more trouble with your definition of religion, which I think is even trickier. Possibly, you can ask a sociologist or a religious person what their definition of religion is, and you'll get completely different answers. Um, and you run down. I like your definition, which you adopted. I think was from Atran. My memory is
Yeah,
goldfish
Scott
memory.
Scott Atran has it, and as I don't even know how to pronounce his surname, Norenzayan, something like that.
Mm,
Adrian wrote this really great book, In Gods We Trust, back in about 2003. And there's a kind of early version of this definition in there. And when I read it, I mean, for him, it was just stipulative. He's a anthropologist, and he was just saying, this maps out the domain of phenomena that I'm interested in. But I think you can probably make more of his definition than that. I mean, I've tweaked it a little bit, but I think that it's pretty handy as an account of religion. It seems to pick up most of the world's religions, and it seems to pick up stuff that's important about religion.
mhm.
But I'm not taking any credit for it. I didn't invent it. I've just borrowed it.
I think it's a great definition. One of the perennial questions in my religious studies classes is what is religion, and and I like that there's a section in your book that criticizes the idea of an in-group definition of religion, because then you just have to ask, but there's many different religions. Unless there's
Yeah,
one person who is of all religions, it's very unlikely that you're going to get a consistent and cohesive in-group definition of religion. So I like that aspect of it. That's an aspect of the book that my religious studies professors would not like, but but I
yeah,
personally do like it. And I also like that you make a distinction in the book um, between worldviews and big pictures, where a worldview is supposed to be this uh, a theory of everything about how the world works. And obviously, this is impossible for us to have because there's always going to be things that you don't notice. Not only are there going to be things that you're not aware of, there's going to be things that you're not aware that you should be aware of.
yeah,
So uh, the thing that we can have is a big picture, which is the best approximation that we can come to a worldview. And this is where naturalism comes in, right? So your understand your big picture for or the best approximation to a worldview is the naturalistic best picture, because you said earlier on in the podcast, it's much simpler. It's much more its explanatory powers is much more impressive, and so with the definition that you and I'll have the definition at the bottom of the screen once I upload the video of religion, so that way people aren't too confused. Your definition of religion is completely at odds with a naturalistic big picture, because by definition religion relies upon it doesn't have to rely upon supernatural, but it does rely upon non-causal or non-natural causal entities. Is that correct?
yeah. So I'm thinking that it just that um, religions, by the way that I can define them, they have these commitments to the kind of satisfaction of non-natural causal entities, or to ways of dealing with non-natural causal structures. And that immediately puts them at odds with the kind of naturalism that I endorse. So my naturalism is just incompatible with religion.
Hmm.
And in particular, it just entails atheism. Gods are just kind of ruled out from my naturalistic picture. Yeah.
Yeah. No, yeah, I completely agree. And I do think that I think it also rules out things like astrology or healing crystals, anything like that. Um, but that really sort of gets people riled up because they'll say things like, "There's a lot of scientific, there's a lot of religious scientists out there. How can you possibly say these things? Or how do you know for a fact that that there is nothing more than just material?" Um,
Right. And the answer to that is I never said I knew it for a fact. Right. This is fallible the way that all philosophizing is fallible. It's just this is the best that I can do. And so, of course, this is what it seems to me that this is the right way to go. So I'm going to run with it. I'm not saying everybody else has to follow me. You make your own judgments about um, when you weigh up the kind of what you can explain versus the kind of simplicity of the resources that you deploy. And if you come up with a different answer, well, good luck to you. That's fine. We've both done the best we can.
yeah, that'd be if you can find if somehow you can find a naturalistic explanation for uh these supernatural religious phenomena. Awesome. I welcome it, even though by definition it seems to sort of, if you do find a naturalistic explanation, then it would no longer be sort of supernatural and religious phenomena, right?
Yeah.
But this opens up the question of what exactly is science and what methodology or specifically are we employing here if we're designating science as the cornerstone for understanding natural reality? Because I always hear a religious person sort of, or the religious people that I've at least interacted with, I shouldn't just say a religious person in general, that the way that we acquiesce knowledge about a particular discipline is always going to be different. There's no scientific uh the scientific method for every scientific discipline. What you do in physics is going to be different than what you do in the humanities, the way that you acquire
Mm.
knowledge. Same thing with history, right? If you're looking at if you're trying to analyze the history of religion, you look through biblical criticism, form criticism, archaeology, sort of sociological approaches. The methodology is different, and so the the first thing that I do want to ask you is, what do we mean by science? What methodology are we specifically talking about? And does that methodology exclude someone saying, well, yeah, different scientific approaches have different methodologies. Same thing goes for the transcendence, the luminescence. We employ a different methodology to understand God and understand religious claims.
So I don't think that there's a single thing, the scientific method. I mean, I agree that chemistry and biology, physics, history all have different methods, right? So I think that there are certain features that science has, the natural sciences, and by that I'm including the humanities in there as well. It's kind of natural sciences in the kind of way that various Europeans use that expression. Um, so there are certain features that I in the chapter on science in the book that I mention. The kind of most important thing here is that there's this kind of ideal that regulates the practices of science, where what we're aiming at is universal expert agreement. And that actually makes a difference both to the way that inquiry is conducted and the various things that are in place to regulate it. So if you think about science, there are expert bodies, there are sort of protocols that govern rewards to scientists for doing science well, and so on. There are also, it's important that there are kind of rules that govern um, the acquisition or the production of data and its interpretation and so on, that all fall under this guiding umbrella of anybody with sufficient training who's one of us will agree on this huge amount of stuff, right? So physics is the same in Kabul, Buenos Aires, um, and Amsterdam. It's not like there's disagreement about what happens in the classical domain between people in those different places. And of course, there's areas of physics that we don't know yet where there's still controversy, but there's a huge amount of stuff that we agree on. And that's true not just for physics, but it's true for biology and history and so on. It's spectacularly not true for religious doctrines,
Mhm.
right? And that's the significant difference, right?
Mhm.
And so if there's no science of the transcendent, there's certainly not one, not even the beginnings of a glimmer of one at the moment, right?
Mhm.
And it's very reasonable, in view of the history of attempts to provide such a thing, that there's just actually no subject matter there. Anyway, that's the naturalistic view.
Mhm.
And it seems that the naturalist is reasonable in taking that position. The reason, you know, people who don't take that position end up playing favourites, um, and they've moved a long way away from the sort of regulative principle of universal expert agreement, which which is the thing that I pick out as the kind of guiding principle of science.
Mhm. I have a friend who's also a naturalist, and he's much more well read on this than I am, of course. And he argues that, yeah, and this, you'll probably find some disagreements with him, but as we've said, there's different varieties of naturalists. He argues that when it comes to trying to understand knowledge, there is a connection, even though there's no one scientific method between the humanities and the hard sciences, or even between the hard sciences. There
Yeah.
is ultimately, as you said, an umbrella under which all these models and these theories about how reality works fall under. And he calls this the big four operational criteria. And this has also been, he didn't create this. This is found in other literature as well, which, one of them is predictive accuracy and precision, explanatory efficiency. The number of posits made is by the model ought to be as few as possible. Optimal flexibility. So the model can't be too rigid to the point where um, it wouldn't be able to sufficiently counter any potential counter arguments. It also can't be way too flexible to the point where it wouldn't concede some losses. And also rational coherence. It has to be internally consistent. And it doesn't matter what discipline it is, they all ultimately abide by this. And he argues, he goes one step further and says, every human actually ultimately abides by this. Our disagreement stems from, because it is a spectrum, not everyone, follows these principles completely. Our disagreement stems from where we are on that spectrum. Scientists are obviously better at abiding by these four operational criteria than the lay person, but that doesn't mean that they have a different complete epistemology. It just means that their understanding of the big four operational criteria are different. I wonder if you sort of agree with that, or if you maybe have some concerns with that understanding.
I wouldn't frame it in terms of scientists. After all, lots of scientists are religious. So it's not somehow or other that scientists are special as people. It's science as a collective activity that's special, I think.
Hmm.
Um, the science as an institution, as a social institution, is structured in special kinds of ways. And that structuring is very different from the structuring of religions as social institutions.
Hmm.
Um, the thing that you said before that about the four features, some of it sounded right. Like the first two things that you mentioned about predictive accuracy and I guess explanatory accuracy, but doing well at managing the way that I see it, and it's controversial, but managing the trade-off between minimizing your commitments and maximizing explanation. That sounded right to me.
Hmm.
the next thing that you said was something. I mean, and um, you also mentioned coherence. This is an interesting one because, for example, in physics at the moment, we have two foundational theories, quantum mechanics and general relativity, that are jointly inconsistent. They're both great theories, but they can't both be globally true. They're inconsistent, and that's why we have this project of looking for quantum gravity, theory of quantum gravity, which we don't have yet. Um, we assume that when we get a theory of quantum gravity, we'll still, in some sense, have um, quantum mechanics as we now have it and general relativity as we now have it as sort of approximations. You know, the way that classical mechanics is, so long as things are not moving too fast, so long as we're not looking at things that are too small, quantum mechanics, classical mechanics just gives us the right answers, basically. Well,
Mhm.
quantum mechanics and general relativity will end up like that. For certain domains, they'll end up being right. But when you go back to the very early universe, they'll break down and there'll be some quantum gravitational theory that's the correct theory that applies there as well as everywhere else.
Mhm.
Um, so it's true that we value consistency, but we live with inconsistency too because of our fallibility. We don't yet have the theory of quantum gravity that we'd like to have, and so there is actually this inconsistency between two well-established theories. If we take their scope to be the whole of the universe, which we just don't do, what we actually do is we think, well, they're right for this much of the universe, right?
Mhm.
not
Right.
not back not back between the before the first, I don't know, trillionth of a second or something. Back there they just break down.
Right. Yeah, and in regard to the the fourth one, the rational coherence that these models must have internal consistency. One of the things that he mentions in his second one, the explanatory efficiency um, criteria, is that not only must the number of posits be made by the model be as few as possible or as reasonably achievable,
Mm.
um, but there must also be a demand for consilience between models, and this is predicated upon the demand that
Yeah,
our total model of reality, all the webs from the multiple disciplines,
yeah.
they be synthesized as closely together as possible. And so he won't say that like a perfect model has 100% of all these things. We can't reasonably expect
Yeah.
that, but rather there's a model ought to be have the perfect combination of these four things in order for
So
us to. Mhm.
in the long term, the ideal would be consilience, right? We'd have a kind of theory of everything where everything fit together. I don't believe we'll ever get there. I suspect that, but you know, that's that's fine. It's fine to talk about the ideal, but you're right. When we think about how science is now, um, the best that we can do is to make various trade-offs. So I do mention consilience in my chapter on science in that book as an important value, though I don't talk about it. I just mention it in the when I'm saying what science is. One of
Mhm.
the science, one of the important values is consilience. So I agree about that too.
Yeah. And I like that term that you used right there, the best that we can do. I think that matters so much, and people really expect a perfect explanation for how things work. Um, and so this goes back to the fourth one, where the demand that the model has internal consistency. Many religious theistic arguments have internal consistency. I think the Kalam cosmological argument, it has some pretty good consistency, internal consistency. The issue, again, it has to do with, well, there's so many added baggage that we have to adopt to our worldview of reality if you adopt the Kalam cosmological viewpoint, that it just makes it too complicated, or the naturalistic viewpoint, it's just much simpler. It explains the ratio at which it explains things with respect to how simple it is. It's just a better equation than the Kalam. I- I- is that how sort of you would look at many of these religious arguments? Not necessarily the Kalam itself, but like with presuppositionalists or anything, it's just a matter of the naturalistic viewpoints. It's simpler. Its explanatory power is much more impressive. The model's just better.
So, I mean, it's kind of interesting. It depends what you mean. So, if you're thinking about cosmological arguments generally, you might think that there are two steps, one of which establishes some conclusion, like that there's the universe began to exist, and then a second step that says that God's the best explanation of the beginning of the universe. Right. So that's sort of the Kalam. So there's the Kalam syllogism, whatever has a cause of its, whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning to exist. The universe began to exist, so the universe has a cause of its beginning to exist. Um, in so that's one kind of argument, but there are other arguments, like um, the argument from contingency, which just says you go through a first. There's got to be a first cause. Right. Now, naturalists can accept that there's a first cause, so they don't have to dispute that argument. What they're going to dispute is the further step that says that the first cause is God. So sometimes the you don't, if you're a naturalist, you don't need to worry about arguing. In the case of the Kalam, you are going to dispute one or other of the premises because you don't think that the universe, natural reality, has a cause. So there, you're kind of you're going to object to one or more of the premises. But in um, a version of, say, Aquinas's second way argument, understood as being an argument that goes sort of back in time, which is arguably not the way that Aquinas intended it. But that argument, that when you get to the conclusion that there's a first cause, you can just say, sure, there was a beginning, right? Um, you might, if you're a naturalist, you don't have to suppose that there was a beginning. You just say, well, look, if it turns out that there's a beginning, that's fine. That's no skin off my nose. And maybe, there's a multiverse, maybe the past in some sense really is infinite. I don't know, that seems kind of an open question at the moment. So I'm not going to go too hard on accepting a sort of the past is finite argument. But if the past turns out to be finite and you want to say the beginning of the universe is um, the first state of the universe is this kind of necessary thing, well, that's fine. You can do that consistently as a naturalist, no problem.
Mhm. I think the argument that I've heard the most come from atheists and theists alike is from theists you'll hear sort of Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, and then I have heard some secular. th- There obviously, Plantinga was a theist and he was using it to sort of argue that naturalism was inconsistent. Uh, there is a secular version, I think, that some people make. Most recently, I heard Donald Hoffman make it. He's a professor of philosophy at I think UCI, and so he just for the sake of clarification, he distances himself from Plantinga and says that he's not saying evolution is not true, or anything like that. He has a whole different view of truth acquisition, but he recognizes an interesting relationship between our cognitive abilities and what evolution gave us here. And so, you know, what I find interesting about this is that the general argument from Plantinga is that Plantinga basically said that on the naturalistic viewpoint, if we did evolve by naturalistic means, and our evolution was not strictly concerned by survival, was strictly concerned with survival and not truth acquisition, then we can't rely on our cognitive faculties to produce actually true beliefs. And if this is the case, if we can't rely on our cognitive faculties because we didn't evolve to understand truth or at least acquiesce truth in a reliable way, then the whole project of naturalism is undermined since it's produced by those cognitive faculties. And you have a long section in your book, Naturalism and Religion, arguing against Plantinga. Um, so, would you say that in Plantinga's view, if it is the case, does the naturalist project rely on the claim that there is some toolkit that is bestowed upon us by evolution that allows us to understand reality accurately enough to be able to come to these conclusions?
Okay, so Plantinga has two arguments. In so I'm thinking about the version of the argument in his book where the conflict really lies. Um, so one of them is that just kind of generally, the probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable given naturalism and evolutionary theory is low, and that leads to a kind of self defeat. And the other one is that the probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable with respect to metaphysics or philosophy, given naturalism
Mhm.
and evolutionary theory, is low. Now, I want to say these are two very different cases and we treat them differently. If you think about our cognitive faculties and you think what we use them for, the probability that they're reliable given naturalism and evolution is actually very high. When I see a tree in the backyard, it's damn near certain that there's a tree in the backyard. And what I'm and the that's exactly what you'd expect given naturalism and evolutionary theory. The if there was, just hypothetically imagine some of our ancestors that are systematically mistaken about which are the big things and which are the small things, they're not going to flourish, right? They're going to run away from ants and cozy up to T-Rexes. They're going to, right. So you can see, I mean, it's very easy to tell a story how at that very general level, when we're thinking about our cognitive faculties, they're going to be reliable in all kinds of ways. I mean, there are limits. So if you think about your visual perception, it's pretty reliable. It's pretty good at telling you that there are cats in the backyard. Not so good about telling you whether there are radon atoms in your house, right? But that's fine, right? Not so good when it's misty or when you've had a few beers or and so on. So there are limits, but pretty reliable in general. And that's what you'd expect given that
Mhm.
we've the long history of evolution. When it
Yeah.
comes to metaphysics and philosophy, obviously we're totally unreliable, right? There's no agreement among us. So it would be absurd to think that our faculty is reliable because by reliability here, what Plantinga means is basically delivers truth most of the time, right? So our visual faculty does that. Our, if we think of ourselves as having a metaphysical faculty, it doesn't. So um, it's not, but it's no threat to naturalism that it turns out that we're not reliable at doing philosophy or that we're
Mhm.
not reliable at doing metaphysics, right? That because all that follows here is that you need to be a bit modest in your metaphysical and philosophical claims. If you're certain about everything in those areas, you're a kind of unusual dogmatist, right? You should be quite tentative. You should recognize the fallibility. And then if you think about having lots and lots of claims that you hold with, say, credence 0.6, right? And you've got 1,000 of these claims. The probability that they're conjunction true for you will be close to zero. That's not a problem. That's just a consistency matter, right? Nonetheless, for each of them, you're at zero point 0.6. So for each of them, you believe them to some extent. Right? It could be that some of your metaphysical claims, and so I'm like this with naturalism, I think the probability of naturalism is really, really high. But the probability of lots of other things that I believe philosophically, I'm down at zero point 0.6 or 0.55 or something like that. When you can join them together, I'm sure that you know, put the whole view together, it's going to be the conjunction of all the claims is going to be close to zero. But that's fine. It doesn't undermine my believing each of the claims in the least.
Mhm.
Right. So that's the response. The important bit is the distinction between the general reliability and then reliability with respect to particular topics.
Mhm.
And Plantinga doesn't really um, have, I think, anything very good to say about why naturalists can't suppose that in general their faculties are reliable for their visual, auditory, and so on. And he doesn't seem to note that whatever that ever that actually we're just not reliable when it comes to metaphysics and philosophy, and that's fine, right? He seems to think that if you thought that, you'd be sort of undermining your philosophical and metaphysical beliefs. Whereas it seems to me that all it does is imposes a kind of fallibilism, a modest fallibilism on your
Mhm.
believing in those areas. That's all that happens.
Yeah. But anyways, Dr. Graham Oppy, we are coming up on the hour here, and I want to thank you once more endlessly for coming on the podcast. Um, I did my best to keep up, but again, I'd like to promote all the debates that you've been on, and or really, if you want to just call them conversations, by all means, because if there's ever evidence that two people with strongly opposing viewpoints can have a cordial conversation, uh, Graham Oppy and Ed Fraser and William Lane Craig are testament to that, as well as picking up many of your books. I recommend them. They're all very accessible and to purchase on Amazon. Also follow him on Twitter, which is you don't seem to be that active on Twitter, but I'll go ahead and promote it if that's okay. You see,
I'm not very active on Twitter. Every now and then. So one of the reasons why I'm on Twitter is because I'm the editor of the Australasian Philosophical Review, and every time
Mhm,
a new issue comes out, I plug it. That's about the extent, and then I kind of watch what's coming through my feed a bit. And
mhm.
that's about it.
All right. So it's like the main place where people can find you just if they YouTube or Google your name, Graham Oppy, read your publications, read your books.
Um, yeah, I guess so. I've got so my publications, my papers are almost all archived at Phil Papers, right? So where the Phil
Hmm.
Phil Papers survey is. Uh, there's also a lot of it's on academia.edu, though I'm not really maintaining that anymore. So there are various places where you can find my papers without having to go through a university library. I would recommend Phil Papers. It's pretty good.
Okay. Well, all right. Well, anyways, once more, Dr. Oppy, thank you so much for coming on. Hope to see you in the future, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. I know you have a busy day ahead of you.
Thank you.